My name's Phil Buchanan. I'm the president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Thank you. And we're going to move straight into our last session. I spend my time working with foundations to help them improve their performance and effectiveness, and we do that in a variety of ways through the research that we pursue, as well as feedback mechanisms that we've created to allow foundations to hear from those who might otherwise just tell them what they think they want to hear. And so I'm a big believer in the importance of data and effectiveness, and none of us would be doing this work if we didn't want to do it well. And this has been a great conference and lots of really good conversation about what it takes to make an impact, what it takes to make a difference. But I think maybe in the last session, in a particularly moving way, we saw the intersection between the personal story, the heart, and the head, the passion to make a difference. And so we're going to talk about those issues a little bit today as we close this conference. Why do we do this work? How do values get conveyed between generations in both directions? And we're going to talk about the heart and the head. So I often say, that's a false choice. There isn't a dichotomy between the heart and the head. That it is your heart that compels you to use your head. And yet it gets experienced, I think, by people doing this work often as a tension. And we want to talk a little bit about that. So we have a great, really interesting panel with diverse perspectives. And I'm really excited about getting them to share a little bit about their personal story, and then the conversation about motivations and about why we do this work. So let me tell you who we have here, and then we'll get into a conversation with them. Peggy Dulany is founder and chair of the Synergos Institute, which is a global nonprofit helping solve complex problems of poverty and inequality by promoting and supporting collaboration. I was reading her longer bio and recognizing that she's been saying for probably 30 plus years what sometimes gets portrayed as a blinding new insight, which is that you really can't accomplish anything on the world's most vexing and pressing social problems alone as a single institution. This has, I think, been obvious to her based on her experience, but for some, they've had to learn that, I guess, the hard way. Also on the panel with us today is Mike Moniz. He's the co-founder, president, and CEO of Circadence, a leader in the cyber defense and network optimization market. And the company has many patents focusing on high growth market segments, including cloud and mobile computing. He is also and I heard some of his stories yesterday, which are truly impressive, record-holding alpinist, and has scaled many mountains with his family. And speaking of his family, his daughter is here as well, Kaylee Moniz. She is also an accomplished climber, the youngest female at the age of 10 to summit Mount Kilimanjaro.
Ooh.
Pretty cool. And she has become very involved in philanthropy, raising funds for many organizations, currently working with the American Himalayan Foundation's Stop Girl Trafficking program to help put an end to female trafficking in Nepal. Finally, really excited to have Carrie Hessler-Radelet, the director of the Peace Corps, on our panel. She has spearheaded in her tenure there reforms to increase the organization's efficiency and engage more volunteers in post-service public education activities. She is a returned Peace Corps volunteer herself and has more than 2 decades of experience in public health focused on HIV and AIDS and maternal and child health. So I want to start just understanding a little bit where each of you are coming from, because this is ultimately deeply personal, why we do the work that we do. And So I'd like to start with you, Peggy. Why do you do this? You've been doing it for a long time. What motivates or drives you? And they're gonna be brief, and we're gonna come back to a lot of the themes that they raise in their opening comments. Peggy?
Thank you, Phil. Well, just starting with the issue you raised about neurons, it's been proven that there are as many or more neurons in the heart and the gut as there are in the brain. So I think I probably was well endowed with heart neurons, or at least I somehow started feeling them early. It may be partly a result of my family upbringing. I'm the fourth generation of the Rockefeller family, which has been involved in philanthropy, so it may have transposed into a genetic defect. But in any case, I had the opportunity to live in Brazil when I was young, and to work and live in a favela, squatter settlement, where I had ample opportunity to see that those facing problems of poverty are those with the greatest commitment to overcome it. Seems like a very simple thing to say, but what was missing was the connections. There was no opportunity for education, for decision-making, for information, and so that kind of stuck in the back of my brain, and later came back in the form of an opportunity to start Synergos, which means working together in Greek, and that's our whole philosophy.
Great. Mike, tell us your story.
Okay, so I'm the one who doesn't really fit into this crowd here. I'm not a professional philanthropist or run a foundation, but we do have a great desire in our family to help and make a difference in the planet wherever we can, and we've made that a part of our journey throughout our entire life. I'm an entrepreneur. I have in tech and life sciences, venture capitalist. I love spending a lot of time coaching companies, helping companies. We love companies that make a difference, that may change the world in some way, bringing a new oncological diagnostic platform or a way to look at the genome in a different way is beautiful work for me. That's what really motivates me. But when I'm not doing that, I love to climb, and we've been climbing as a family since the kids were really young. Kaylee learned how to ski when she was, I think, just old enough to walk on the driveway in our place in Winter Park. And since then, we had an opportunity to introduce the children, and particularly Kaylee's twin brother, Matt, initially to the Himalayas. When he was 9, we walked to Everest Base Camp. And I saw this amazing spark of passion in his soul that it was really amazing how he bonded with the people, with the mountains, with the culture. And there was a moment along the way that he had an opportunity to interface with a Korean reporter, and was very intrigued with why this 9-year-old was wandering around the Himalayas amongst these 7,000, 8,000 meter peaks. He looked a little unusual. So they interviewed him, and I think there was a moment, there was an opportunity for him to talk about something that was not about him too, and that was a great teachable moment. So throughout our journey, which has taken us from the Himalayas to the Caucasus, to the Savannah, and to the top of Africa, we have enjoyed an amazing connection with people, and we've tried to make that an opportunity to learn about the issues that confront the people in those areas, and come up with strategies that the kids can do the research and make an impact. And so that's evolved from simple things like being involved with the orphanages in Africa to most recently on a larger scale, and Kaylee will talk a little bit about her work with Stop Girl Trafficking, but has made a difference with as many as 200 young women that are now not part of the trafficking circle. So this has been, I'm going to continue. I don't know where the Odyssey will take us. We'll continue to develop and evolve our strategy as we go along.
Mm-hmm. Great, and Kaylee, thanks for being here. And you were telling me yesterday that not only have you been going to the conference, but then you've got to stay up on your homework, and you're probably the only one in this crowd who has to worry about homework. And so tell us a little bit about your involvement, and I suppose you could have just kind of focused on the climbing, which is a passion of yours and your family's, but you got involved in other ways, and tell us why and what that looks like.
Well, I think of it as giving back to the community, because I've been given many amazing opportunities to go travel around and visit many cultures. So I like to, whenever I go somewhere, do some research and see what I can do to make it a better place. And my first major exposure to poverty was, as Phil said, in Tanzania when I climbed Kilimanjaro. And my brother and I decided to gather a bunch of money and presents from our birthday. That was a month before, and then we gave it to the children's orphanage there. And that's what really opened my eyes to some of the things that children face every day around the world. And the following year, we raised money for doing 14,000 peaks in Colorado in 14 days for the pulmonary arterial hypertension, like heart-lung disease, because my brother has a good friend that has it. And after that, my brother and I we led an expedition to Nepal, the Everest Base Camp, and that's where we got really into the Stop Girl Trafficking, or the American Himalayan Foundation program. And we raised over $25,000 just by going around doing some presentations, explaining to people before we left why we were going there. And that's probably what opened my eyes to the most. In fact, I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Prakash. He did a presentation on the first day about the microscopes. And I'm going to go back out to Asia at the end of the month as soon as I finish school, because my brother's currently on Everest right now. I'm going to try to see if I can bring some of those microscopes to the girls in the schools, like introduce it, because I think it's a really great tool. It's only 50 cents. And I think that it could really help them become valuable to the community. And it's great for many applications like agriculture and water quality. I'd really like to get connected with that. That's
great. Great, thanks. Carrie, how about you? So you're now running an organization that had a profound impact on your life, presumably early on. I don't know if you thought, when you were in the Peace Corps, oh, I'm gonna come back and run this place, but here you are. Yeah. So
I have
tell
to
us
say
about
that thought never crossed my mind.
Yep.
I do know that my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer with my husband in Western Samoa in the early 80s absolutely transformed my life. And it was the reason that I went into a public health career, and I've spent my entire career now, 25 years, in the international development field. The decision to come back to Peace Corps was actually a very easy decision, because it is an organization that changes lives, not only the volunteers, but also the communities with which we work. And the model is unique. I do believe it's unique. We live and work as members of the community for 2 years, learning the language, eating the same food, riding the same transportation, working side by side on the priorities of the community. And so through that process of being a volunteer and learning what life is like in a village, seeing poverty up front and living at poverty level with members of my community absolutely transformed my life. Now, what continues to inspire me every single day are the volunteers that are around now and the incredible tools that they bring. And I know we're going to talk about it, but I want to just tell one story from last week. Last week I was in Peru, and I do travel a lot to visit our volunteers and oversee our programs. And last week I visited with a volunteer who's a water and sanitation volunteer, and she had been working with a group of other partners to help build latrines in very, very remote areas. And they followed a very prescribed process, working with the Ministry of Public Works to identify exactly the right locations for the community latrines. And it was fantastic, and she studied and spoke Quechua very well. And so they were able to reach a number of different villages, with her really serving as the translator and helping the community identify the right place for the latrine. Well, she told me this just incredibly moving story of how in one of her communities, they had just finished this incredible community latrine, and they were just about to leave the community, and they stopped at a little shop to get some water, and she noticed a woman who was just around the corner sobbing, absolutely sobbing. And so she just went over to her and spoke in Quechua and asked her, well, what's the matter? And it turns out that this young woman named Inez is the mother of a 2-year-old child. She had been left by her husband, who also left her HIV. And she had been locked out of her own family's latrine, and she had already been told that she would not be allowed to use the community latrine. And she was devastated that now there was this beautiful new latrine in her village, and she would never be able to use it. And she and her little child, every time they needed to use the toilet, had to go over the sand dune and find a place. And there are very few trees there. There's no privacy because it's on a sand dune. Any of you have been to Peru? Peru is actually a desert, and much of it's along the coastline. And she was devastated because she looked at this community latrine and thought, that will never be for me. And so our volunteer was able to, speak to the group, and they constructed a latrine with the materials they had left in this woman's house. So, I mean, that's a small story, except for it gets to the heart of what Peace Corps is, and that is she would never have known that. Nobody, there's a whole team of hydrologists and Ministry of Health people in that community. They would never have known that that woman had that situation because none of them spoke Quechua and they didn't take the time. But because this Peace Corps volunteer is so in tune with the needs of her community and she understood the language well, she was able to pretty quickly develop a bond with that woman, identify what the problem is, and work with then a team of others to solve a problem that was deeply personal to this woman and changed her life. I'm quite certain of it. Just to have, when you're in that situation, to have someone say, I care enough about you and I'm going to do something about it right now, it speaks volumes. And so it is an incredible privilege to me to be able to serve this agency that not only gave me my own career, but also frankly, gave careers to at least 1/4 of USAID and 1,000 State Department and probably 1/3 at least of all NGOs leaders who work overseas. The Peace Corps has been foundational for so many. Can I ask, are there any returned Peace Corps volunteers here? See, there we go.
Wow.
Thank you for your service.
So,
thank you for your service.
Carrie, that's a great story, and it raises a lot of issues that I think we wanted to talk about here, including the importance of actually listening to the people you seek to help. And that gets lost sometimes. So there's a lot of good intentions, and those good intentions can come from really important, deeply personal places, but we don't have to really think that hard to think of examples of initiatives, programs that sounded great, that made a lot of sense to those who cooked them up, that didn't work in the way people thought they were going to work, either didn't have an effect or had a negative effect. So certainly there are plenty of examples in the world, in areas of international development and domestically. Everyone likes to trot out because they're good, well-worn examples, and they're old enough that you don't run too much of a risk of offending anyone in the room. DARE or Scared Straight as programs that didn't work, right? DARE is different now, and maybe it works now, but were rigorously evaluated too late. Scared Straight seemed to make a lot of sense. You trot in a former prison inmate to a school assembly to talk about you shouldn't pursue a life of crime. The only problem was it turned out once it was finally evaluated, attitudes about crime went in the opposite direction. Or you look at more contemporary examples, another domestic one here in the US, the $100 million spent in Newark, New Jersey on education reform that I think, from what I read anyway, pretty well documented, didn't work out. And people weren't necessarily involved in the process of what was going to happen in their community. So, Peggy, you must deal with this with your work and your clients. how do you think about avoiding unintended consequences? How do you think about the balance between the passionate desire to do something and the need to know that what's being done is not only going to have the desired effect, but not have an unintended negative consequence?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I can start with my own learning from failure.
Great.
I ran a program on education and youth employment for the New York City Partnership for 5 years in the 80s. And it was a wonderful organization that brought together government, labor, business, community organizations, and had really commitment at the top. However, the people at the top thought they were so smart that among themselves they could create the solutions. And of course, there was no consultation, for example, with teachers or principals in the schools. So the solutions to improving schooling sounded great, but they didn't get the buy-in. And if you don't have the buy-in, either it's going to be passively accepted or resisted because they didn't have any input. So actually, that was partly why I decided to start Synergos, because I could see the value of collaborative problem solving, but I could also see that if you don't include those who are, quote, the beneficiaries in the planning of how it should be approached, there's liable to be a disconnect somewhere. So just one of the best stories I know of inclusion is Gram Vikas in Orissa in India, the poorest state in India, or at least equally porous, one or two of the others, where some volunteers went after the cyclone in the early 70s and began working with people to rebuild. And at one point had 800 architects and engineers volunteering, but they learned they had to retrain them all because, again, they were coming in with an attitude of, okay, we know what kind of buildings you need to resist the next cyclone, not what does the social structure require. And so instead, by talking to people, they came up with sanitation as absolutely the first criterion and ended up creating a pool of capital that allowed every family to have their own private toilet and bathing facility, which reduced gynecological diseases by 80% and just had an amazing impact on, therefore, economic development. On your story, Carrie, I would have loved it if, and maybe this will still happen, if the Peace Corps volunteer could have convinced the community that they didn't have to give her own private toilet, that that it could have gone on as an educational thing. But that takes.
Well, actually, I think that is what happened. In this particular community, that is what happened.
Oh, good. So it wasn't that they built her own private
No, they
toilet.
did build her own, but then they continued to work. This volunteer was actually not from that community.
Yeah.
But she started to work with the community.
Yeah. It's just, thinking ahead of the emergency of one person, which obviously rends the heart, to what could be a longer term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sounds like that did happen, which is great. And that's what happened here because they were listening particularly to the women in the community and what was the source of the problems.
Great. And so, Mike and Kaylee, I'd like to ask you this question, and I'll ask it, maybe in its harshest formulation, just to see what you would say. People might look at you and say, well, you're coming here for your recreation, going on your climbs, and great that you want to do something, but what do you know really? How do you avoid? Do you worry about unintended consequences of what you're doing, or how do you avoid making mistakes that might lead to, again, either not having the desired impact or having a negative impact? Is this something you talk about as a family?
Well, I think so. That's it's an interesting perspective. We certainly, I think it's easy to be the accidental tourist and wander through the valley and want to make an impact here or leave some goodwill in various places along the way. But the reality is that we've tried as a family to do a lot of deep research. And one of the wonderful things that we did was we brought a large group of our friends together, and we invited several different nonprofits to come in and present about that region, where we have the DZI Institute that's doing some wonderful things in the southern Himalayas in terms of sanitation, and present what they're doing, and really look for things that resonate in the heart, and what makes that meaningful to us and as a family and the kids, and what can they get behind. And clearly the girl trafficking, when you have 6 or 7 young teenage women in the room, it definitely resonates. So I think it's different than walking through the Khumbu and saying, hey, look, can I donate $500 to your school? Which we did the first time. It was all a learning experience, and we learned that the building's easy to build. It's the teacher that it has to be in that building for multiple years that needs the support.
Great. Kaylee, you want to add to that?
So I don't really know the right answer to this, but I talked with Neil yesterday, and he told me about Nike's work to stop child labor, and in the outcome, it ended up in a dramatic increase in child sex trafficking because the families lost a source of income. So it's just something we really need to think about, is fixing one problem while creating another problem. So like when we raised money for the Stop Girl Trafficking, I got to meet with the founder of that, Dr. Aruna Abarty, and then she told me we need if you raise this much money, you'll put this many girls in school. They say education is the key because it makes them more valuable to the community. And just raising $100 is enough to put one girl in school, give her school supplies, a uniform, tutoring for a full year, and then she's safe. And so just raising, when we raised $25,000, and we were able to put 250 girls in a school for a full year. So I don't really know the correct answer to this, but I just think that the unintended consequences a really important thing to think about and to acknowledge.
Right. No, and my view would be there isn't a correct answer except to be aware of how easily that can happen. I mean, that's a great example, and I've heard similar ones of work to help teenage girls. This is a domestic example, but teenage girls who are involved in gangs to get out of the gangs, and then very high pregnancy rates of the girls who successfully remove themselves from the gang affiliation because there was something about a sense of purpose or connection that was gone for them, and this was not something that the folks working on this program had anticipated. So I think it happens all the time in all kinds of ways. I want to talk, for obvious reasons about generational differences. I'll confess that honestly, I get a little tired of reading, I don't know about y'all, but reading about generational differences, and sometimes wonder whether we can really generalize about large swaths of people in the way that we sometimes do. But clearly, there are differences. Carrie, my understanding is you come from four generations in your family of Peace Corps volunteers. What do you see in the current crop that's different? What can we learn from them? Or are they similar to the way folks joining the Peace Corps have always been in terms of the idealism and perspective that they bring?
I think the idealism is still there, but this generation of volunteers comes so much better equipped than I was. I mean, first of all, they've had a lot more experience before they entered Peace Corps. Many of them have done junior year abroad. They've done some sort of service abroad. I mean, there are just so many more opportunities now than there were 30 years ago when I was a volunteer. In addition, we've learned more about the development field in the last 25, 30 years. There are best practices out there that Peace Corps is actually working with other partners very closely. And actually, I'd like to give you an example of that because it illustrates how today's volunteers are using the tools, technologies, and their experience to be able to make a difference. The other thing I would say about this generation of volunteer, and I think it comes because they have so much experience, is that they have a level of confidence in their ability to make a difference than I think existed when I was a volunteer. But just the example that I want to give you is the example of a young man named Ian Hennessy, who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal, and he was part of a community health team. He lived in Kédougou, for those of you who've been to Senegal. It's an area of very high prevalence of malaria. And he was a very close friend and next door neighbor with the head of his community health team. His name was Sheikh Tambian. And one day, very soon after Ian arrived, after they had just, ironically, completed a sweep of the entire village to distribute bed nets to the community, Sheikh's 4-year-old niece became very ill and then died of cerebral malaria. She was a 4-year-old, and everyone was completely heartbroken because here they were using one of the best sort of interventions for malaria. The child was sleeping under a bed net and had been for about a month, and yet she still died of malaria. Well, the reason she died of malaria is because there's a reservoir of latent malaria that's asymptomatic in communities there. People who have grown up in malarial regions carry malaria, are able to maybe even, and are also able to transmit and don't maybe develop symptoms, but they are able to transmit. And they were not, that reservoir existed. It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to stomp out malaria. So Ian and Sheikh got together and thought, what can we as a community do? And they talked to their health workers and they said, we got to get rid of that latent reservoir of malaria. They were already empowered by the government of Senegal, which is very progressive, to be able to diagnose and treat malaria, but they were very passive. They waited for sick people to come to them. And so they had the idea, and this was a community-based idea. This was the Sheikh's idea along with Ian, to go out every week, once a week, to every single household in that small community and test if anyone was sick with malaria, test them if they were positive, and then treat them on the spot. But not only did they do that, if they noticed that there was more than one case in that family, they tested everyone around them to get at that latent malaria. So they asked the Centers for Disease Control and the National Malaria Control Program if they could pilot this new initiative. And they said, yeah, we're interested. And so the Centers for Disease Control decided to do a case control study. So they found another village, 30 miles away that had the same bed net coverage rate and the same incidence rates. And that was the control village. And so for one rainy season, Sheikh and Ian and their group did this proactive, what has now become known as proactive case detection and treatment model. They went out to every community once a week. Every household once a week. And at the end of that rainy season, compared to the control village, there was a 90% decrease in malaria incidence and no malaria deaths for the first time in 30 years in that community. So then the district health head said, well, can you, this is nice in a little village, but I don't know if this model is scalable. Can you do it in 5 villages? So Sheikh and Ian and their team of 5 health workers trained the other community health workers in those other 5 villages, and then CDC did the same study, this time with 5 case and 5 control villages. And they did it again. And again, the result was 90% decrease in malaria incidence. I'm really proud to say that this passed just about a couple months ago. They just completed doing it in the entire southeastern region of Senegal, population 1.45 million people. Sheikh and his ever-growing team of community health workers, they've been training each other. Now it's literally this case control, this proactive case detection and treatment approach has been fully managed by community health workers with the help of 17 Peace Corps volunteers. And the result was an 88% decrease in malaria incidence at scale. So our team has now gone to WHO. We're working with the UN. We're working with the President's Malaria Initiative, which was a partner from the beginning, I should say, and the Centers for Disease Control. This was a model that was successful because it came from the community. They listened to the community itself knew what the problem was. Yep. And the advantage of the volunteer in this case is because the volunteer was able to link them up with services. First of all, the CDC that could do the research. So it's so important to listen to the community. And just to your earlier point, I couldn't agree more, Peggy. I don't honestly know how much interaction my volunteer had with that community, because my understanding was that the volunteer was not from that community. They certainly talked to that community. But the thing about Peace Corps volunteers is they live in the village, and they're there for 2 years. And they don't just do what they came to do. They have girls' empowerment clubs, and they do hand washing in school, and they grow a permanent garden with pregnant women. And they just do all sorts of things that meet the holistic needs of the community as identified by the community.
What a great example that is of a heartbreaking story leading to a motivation to do something, and then the rigorous sort of testing of it.
And I would also say, though, Ian is now working for CDC.
So that's great. So we're talking about really listening to folks in the community, but I want to also come back to this other topic of listening across generations, right? So, and one of the critiques you hear sometimes of nonprofits and foundations, and companies for that matter too, is that we have this sort of hierarchical, what Henry Timms at 92nd Street Y calls a sort of old power mindset, where it's command and control. And yet you have this generation of folks entering the world of nonprofit sector or businesses that have a social purpose, who really aren't interested in waiting to feel like they're contributed, and they don't necessarily have the. I remember when I was in business school, people talked about learn, earn, serve, right, as the 3 stages in life. Sort of you had to do one at a time, right? And clearly that isn't the model now. I'd like to just explore this a little bit more. And Mike, I mean, what have you learned from Kaylee has her or her brother's involvement in philanthropy, or the way they've approached it, affected how you think, how you approach that work, or your work in business?
Sure, I think that one of the things that I've learned is that there's really the boundaries we put around our expectations for our generations, our children, is really not always what we think it is. I think their capabilities are beyond what we think. Their abilities to impact the world and the community doesn't really get necessarily better as they get older. They have the ability and the desire to make a difference, even at the youngest age. I think they can relate to that. And I think if you give them the opportunity to serve, they will serve and probably exceed your expectations. I know that there's a great article that's been floating around social media that was written in Fast Company about the kind of what makes us happy. And it's a wonderful story. I highly recommend it if you just to Google this, the science of what makes you happy. It turns out after they rigorously looked at what makes people happy, it's buying things, owning things, material possessions give us a moment of happiness, but we're never connected with that material thing. It's always separate from us. But our collective soul is really the sum of all of our life experiences. And I believe that the opportunity to take the family in and experience the actual philanthropic, rather than just writing a check or responding to a commercial or donating at the local supermarket. There's an entirely different experience, the way it affects the soul, by reaching in and understanding the issue, doing the things that the community needs, but listening and learning. And one great example, and I think that what we've done as a family is really try to understand how little things, even on an individual level, work, and then look for scale in that. How do you go from being moved about a particular issue, about seeing a child on the street who's obviously been sold into a sex trafficking ring or job, and how do you make a difference on a larger scale? So, that's been, I think, from our perspective, that opportunity to get them out, see it, and engage with it, and make a difference, and that's happening every day.
Great. And Kaylee, what about you? I mean, how do you experience this? Do you feel like you learned a lot from your parents, or have they learned more from you in all this?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be doing this much if it weren't for my dad getting into mountaineering and my family traveling so much. So basically, like, you know, my dad, like, encouraged Matt and I to, you know, give all of our presents and money from our birthday to them. And then at first we were like, oh, I don't want to do that. But then once you actually see it given to them and how happy they all are, it's like, it's a good feeling.
Yeah.
So that's what really made us want to keep on doing what we do and keep giving out to the community. So all I'm saying is, if it wasn't for just a little bit of encouragement, then it wouldn't have started. But definitely also, like, as a whole family, like, we want to do what is best for the world, and it's like a long life goal too, to help others and help the community. So
I think you'd be a good Peace Corps volunteer.
Yeah. So, Peggy, I want to ask you something, because there's been, Peter Singer has gotten more and more attention in recent years, and I think he, you know, and I don't know him, I've never met him, but from what I've read, I think his argument would be, you know what, personal experience, personal passion, being moved by this or that, for example, philanthropy that's affected by the loss of a loved one to a disease, this is not the way we should be choosing our goals. He would argue that that's not the moral way to decide how to give, and that in fact, you know, we should be not just rigorous on the strategy and implementation front in terms of, does the thing that we think is going to work, and how do we iterate it, but equally analytical and rigorous when it comes to goal selection. And that some goals are more worthy than others, and we should analyze them in terms of, you know, basically lives saved per dollar spent. How do you think about that, working with clients, and do you agree with him or do you disagree?
So I'm going to come at it from a completely different perspective, and then you can tell me if I answered the question or not. What I believe is that our wholeness as a person allows us to make the right kinds of decisions, both in terms of what's worthy out there and also in terms of our own passion. That all of us are shaped by our childhood experiences, including fears or trauma or whatever, that keep us from being whole, that keep us from listening deeply because we're afraid, so we close our heart. So we don't have access to the neurons of the heart and the gut. And what I would say is, if we're only using the neurons of our brain, there may be a certain logic to what we do, but then we're lacking that whole part of both passion, compassion, and the ability to open ourselves to really listening to what the situation is out there. And I trust that when people can work through some aspects of that fear at least, and really open themselves, that they will see what the reality and what the needs are. If they're not doing the listening, then any amount of logic is not, in my view, liable to lead to the optimal outcomes.
And yet, just to push on this and maybe ask others on the panel if they have a perspective, and yet we look at the amount of philanthropy today that goes to institutions of higher education, for example, with enormous endowments. Is that smart? I mean, should we be more challenging of the philanthropic choices that folks are making? More judgmental about what really qualifies as philanthropy?
Well, I wouldn't want to take on higher learning. My husband's a professor at Georgetown. But what I would say is that if you don't listen and your heart is not open, you may be working on entirely the wrong problem. So a quick example. In Burkina Faso, there was a team of experts who came in because they noticed in a particular area that there was a very low level of girls' education. And they were trying to figure out what is it about this village that girls were not going to school. And after, I don't know, a week of study, the experts came back and they said, the parents don't value education. So what we need to do is get a training for parents about the importance of girls' education and how it's going to increase their family income in the long run. And there was a Peace Corps volunteer there who attended the briefing of this expert team, and she said, that doesn't make any sense to me at all, because every village, every mom and dad that I know in this village values education. But in fact, there are so many other barriers to girls' education that aren't even raised here. And so she spoke up and she said, I don't really know what the answer is, but I don't think that's the right answer. And so they decided to then talk to more people, to ask the girls themselves. They hadn't talked to the girls themselves. And then they went back and they started doing some more research that was done in the local language. And the Peace Corps volunteer helped as a translator, really, more than anything. So the same experts stayed, but they started doing their research in the local language, not even in French, which is Burkina Faso, they have French, but they also have the local language. And all the previous research had been done with the village heads in French. So when they started to get down in the local language, what they found out is that the parents were terrified because there were a couple teachers at school that had very bad reputations of abusing young girls. They were also scared about the walk to and from school. It was like a 4 or 5 mile walk, and it was known to be a dangerous area. And so those were major constraints. It turns out that the parents were trying to protect their children from this abuse and danger on the road. And so therefore, it appeared, if you looked at it the surface, it seemed like the parents weren't convinced of the benefit of school. But what they saw instead as a problem was actually the immediate safety right there and then of their girls. So it demanded an entirely different intervention. It demanded an intervention at the school to talk about no sexual abuse in school, and we need to be supporting our girls so they can be successful in learning. And it also caused them to rethink where they were placing their schools, their secondary schools. They were too far away. So all I'm saying is that sometimes if you don't really listen and if you don't get down to the community, you might be solving the wrong problem.
Yeah, and in that way, that seems to me an important way in which, and maybe this is just stating the obvious, but this work, and I'd be interested in your view on this, Mike, and then we'll start to wrap up, but in which this work is different than business, right? And maybe that is stating the obvious, and yet over the last 10, 15 years, we see a lot of folks who say, well, what philanthropy needs is to be more like a business, and I always wonder, like, which one? Enron, Apple, when it was doing poorly or when it was doing well, and because what happens in business typically is if there's many differences, but one is you kind of hear from your customers typically if you're not giving them what they expect. A little different in this world. You might not hear from, as we've been saying, from intended beneficiaries for all kinds of reasons, including they might not be comfortable saying how things are going. So, Mike, what's harder for you? Being good you're very successful in business. What's harder, that or doing the philanthropic work you're now doing more and more of effectively?
Well, I think that the philanthropic work is certainly a challenge. And there's an enormous amount of complexities that you wouldn't choose to introduce to a business plan, right? But it is what it is, right? So you just deal with it. So for example, in the Khumbu Valley, leading up to Mount Everest, everyone's probably seen a little different look at the issues around the Sherpa culture and just the challenges they face, the dangers they face. But it's very interesting. For example, Conrad Anker and John Krakauer, good friends, have built the Fort Safe Climbing School, which is designed to really encourage technical expertise and proficiency so that they're safer when they're climbing. Sherpas are safer, they're more comfortable with their rope work, and they're also able to lead expeditions at a higher level. One of the things they did, they introduced the technical side, but didn't introduce a lot of the kind of the more safety-oriented side in terms of rescue, in terms of judgment calls, and other things. So they made a huge investment in the community, had millions of dollars. Montana State participated in building this facility, and some of the unintended consequences that make this really complex when you're trying to do something on a scale and do something well, and you have what you think is a good business plan, is all these cultural dynamics and caste systems and other things. So what we found now is that there's even a greater divide between the Southern Khumbu porters and now the highly educated Sherpa population. So it's more difficult for them we used to see a little bit of blending. We had climbing Sherpas from different regions. Now you're seeing really just very elite portions, and there's a kind of a pushback in the community from allowing anyone else to attend these schools other than people from those villages. So we're seeing these really highly complicated issues now that are manifesting themselves in real conflict on the mountain, because now the skills that the Sherpas have, and they're finding a voice that they haven't had in the last 50 years. And they're saying, hey, this is our country and our mountain and our life, and we want to be leading these companies, and we want this to be our industry, not your industry. And so that's great, but it has created this conflict between Western companies, Western guides, and also safety has been in large part compromised. Almost all the deaths that happened when I was on Everest in 2012 were attributed to startup, early stage, Asian-based trekking companies that had just enough skill to get. So it's an interesting paradigm, and one that is highly complicated by just the nature of people you don't understand.
Right. Great. Thank you. We're gonna, before we wrap up and turn it back over to Jane for some concluding comments, Peggy, I want to turn to you and just see if you can help me wrap this up. So I'm handing over what should be my job to you and say, what themes do you see here as you think about this conversation and the conference that you would like people to leave the room thinking about, and do that in 3 minutes or less?
Well, what I've loved about this almost conversation is the extent to which the panelists have stories that imply how deeply you have been listening, that you pay attention to stories. And to me, all the evaluation in the world is wonderful and necessary. But unless we have the anecdotes in our hearts, not just in our minds and in our reports, it doesn't guide us the way I think we can be guided by the experience of being there, which you said, Kaylee, very well, and listening and responding, but not just listening and then deciding, but having an interactive, ongoing relationship, which allows us to see as we move along, well, did we miss that, or what's the next thing? Where can we go from here? So to me, it's been very satisfying hearing the extent to which people's neurons in their bellies and their hearts appear to be well connected to their brains. And what I take away from this is only feeling more confirmed that we need to pay attention to all aspects of ourselves and all aspects of the people we're interacting with, particularly those who we often define as the beneficiaries.
That's great. That was a wise choice I made. And I think it's important, Dan, I'm going to ask you all to stay seated as we wrap this up, because we're going to switch right over to Jane and some concluding comments. But it's important for us to remember, step back and remember that progress happens. And you look at, worldwide child mortality, for example, in the last 30, 40 years. So progress happens as significant as the challenges are that we face. So I want to thank Carrie and Kaylee. I'm feeling very optimistic about the future. You know, if you're like, if there are more 17-year-olds out there like you, Mike and Peggy, for really thoughtful comments and a great panel. So please join me in thanking them. And finally, just as I turn over to Jane, I just want to say, great conference, Jane. Congratulations, and thanks to you and your staff for doing a wonderful job.
Thank you, Phil. So thank you. What a marvelous panel. Carrie, so just want everybody to know that Carrie's connection to GPF is even deeper, that you know one of our first speakers ever was Steve Radelet, Carrie's wonderful husband. So yeah, oh my gosh, they're the same two Radelets. But he's a development economist and an extraordinary man, and you are an extraordinary woman. So thank you. Thank you for making this a family affair. Yeah. So, I mean, most of all, we're going to want to hear from you. And so what you'll find is there are surveys there, and also we'll be emailing you a survey. But I just wanted to make just a few concluding thoughts before we turn it over to Gary to give us some beautiful music. And that is that I hope, you know, I started out by saying the Global Philanthropy Forum is a community. I say it, but I hope you have felt it. There are lots of newcomers around. There were lots of newcomers among us. You're old timers now. Thank you for being part of this community. The second thing I wanted to say is that, you know, philanthropy is audacious, right, at its best. We're ambitious, and to realize those ambitions, I'm becoming increasingly persuaded that we need to leverage one another. Not just fellow philanthropists, not only our grantees, but also bear in mind that, you know, to achieve these completely audacious goals, we need the efficiency and scale of the private sector, and we need the accountability of democratic governments, and, you know, we need the agility of a grassroots organization that is responsive to those it serves, and ultimately, of course, we need the risk appetite and the long view of philanthropy. We need all of those attributes in order to achieve our goals. And to that end, as you think about leveraging governments, bear in mind that there are a few key opportunities that we've discussed in the hallways and in working groups and breakfasts. The first is EDIS. In July, governments will come together to try to figure out what is the financing of these incredibly ambitious development goals. What are the mechanisms there? The second one will be the UN General Assembly in September, at which the follow-on to the MDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, will be forged. Do talk to Ed Kane at the Hilton Foundation, and do talk to Heather Grady at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors about ways to get your learnings into the mix. It doesn't mean that everybody has to go to ADIS and everybody has to go to New York, but you can transfer the knowledge you've gained, and they are happy to really help in that regard. The second opportunity that relates to governments is President Obama's trip to Kenya. That is always an opportunity to shine the spotlight on the possibilities for change. If you know of terrific innovations in Africa that he can shine a spotlight from, that he can learn from, those that should be scaled and those that shouldn't, you know, those that gain their value from their smallness, from their size, from their deep roots in the community. And that's something that you learn through your grant making that the White House may or may not know. So there is an opportunity, and wants to know. So there's an opportunity to share. If you're interested in doing that, just get in touch with us. Or if you simply want to be kept abreast of what they're doing, get in touch with us for that as well. So those are two opportunities for leveraging governments. Leveraging each other. I've said a lot. First of all, I hope we see you next April 4th to 6th in Redwood City. at the next Global Philanthropy Forum, so you'll take advantage of those opportunities to learn from and leverage each other. But I've said a lot about, or I've mentioned a lot, the African Philanthropy Forum. You can see I have kind of a passion for that. But this is an example of Africans who are investing in the success of Africa, investing in the success of fellow Africans, and learning from and leveraging one another in the process because they want to have impact. Well, we can learn from them too. If you look at the Global Philanthropy Forum community, and we constantly are surveying you to find out where your interests are, the overwhelming majority has one part of their portfolio at least grant making in Africa. Think what you would learn from your peers there. Think how helpful that would be. And I mention that, because we also have the more mature, the longer lasting collaboration with Aegis in order to, and Paolo Fabiani, to build the Brazil Philanthropy Forum. Similar situation, similar set of opportunities. But I would just note, and Paolo will remember this, and so will Marcus, will remember this. In their first conference, a Nigerian philanthropist invited himself to their conference because he knew what we know, and that is that the next great philanthropic innovation is going to come from the South, and that knowledge is going to be transferred in the South. So in fact, these are opportunities for the kind of knowledge building that we think are both, help us be effective, but also are fun. I also want to note that, sort of keying off of this panel a little bit, that philanthropy is about knowledge, it's about strategy, it's about continuous learning, but of course it's also about values. I mean, that's what motivates, that's what animates. And I kept thinking last night as we were listening to that panel on technology, I thought, well, how would I sum this up, right? And for me, the way I'd sum it up, and I don't know if others agree, is I kept thinking to myself, technology without values, untied to values, can indeed be dangerous. But values without technology can also be ineffectual. So how do we marry the two? Because that will always be that combination will give us the impact we want. Sort of to paraphrase Tony Blair, I loved it when he said, in essence, there's a funny thing about change. In the beginning, we resist it. In the midst, we labor through it, and excuse me for paraphrasing, but in the end, we're really glad we did it. And I thought that was very apt for us. I want to thank all of the speakers. It was heavy lifting for them. I mean, I think they had fun, but they were working, and they really raised the level of my understanding, at least, and so I was very grateful. We also have leaders that really help us. Lorene Powell-Jobs is the chair of our advisory committee. Peter Robertson is chair of our board, and we're really grateful to them as well. And of course to both the Ford and MacArthur Foundations that last night not only got us riled, but got us fed, which is a great combination. I want to just give a special shout out to the staff. These are really remarkable. They're remarkable women, plus one man, to show that I am open-minded and I do my best to employ a man. So I just want to shout out particularly to the GPF specific team, although the Aspen team is here, the World Affairs Council team is here, but Susie Antunian heads up all our strategy and is so brilliant. Michelle Dilworth headed up the communications. Ashley Ray is responsible for the content. If this was strong for you in terms of content, Ashley's your woman. Suaka Sonoyama is the person who vetted, sought out, found each of our speakers. And in fact, vetted, sought out, and found 10 times as many. We just could only fit so many on the stage, but just did a brilliant job of that. Carla Thorson gives the overall organization to it. Carla's in the back. I swear I'm going to turn my life over to Carla. In fact, I guess I just did. And then Nicole Wood is the person who got you here and greeted you with a smile. So thank you to all of them.